The morning they carried Nora Whitfield's belongings out of the house and threw them into the mud, the temperature in Harlan County, Kentucky had already dropped below freezing. It was November of 1937. The girl was 15 years old. One boot was split clean through at the sole, so her left foot was bare against frozen ground. She stood in the lane outside the only home she had known for 3 years, and she watched her dead mother's Bible sink slowly into a puddle of red clay. The wind came down off the ridge like something alive and angry. It found every gap in Nora's coat, every thin place in the wool she had darned and redarned until the fabric was more patched than original cloth. It found the bare skin of her left foot and did what cold wind does to bare skin in November in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, which is to say it made itself known immediately and without apology. She did not cry. She had learned in 3 years under Aunt Hester Pruitt's roof that crying accomplished nothing except giving Hester another reason to call her weak. And Nora Whitfield had learned very early that she could not afford to appear weak in front of people who had already decided what she was. Aunt Hester stood on the porch with her arms folded across her chest, her face the color of old paste, her expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a woman who has waited a long time to do something and is finally doing it. She wore her good coat, the gray wool one she kept for church, which meant she had dressed for this occasion the way other women dress for funerals, with intention, with the awareness of being seen. Behind her, barely visible in the shadow of the doorframe, stood her husband. Uncle Declan Pruitt was a quiet man. He had been quiet every day for the 3 years Nora had lived under his roof. He had been quiet when Hester worked the girl from before dawn until after dark. Quiet when she slept in the unheated attic room with frost forming on the inside of the window glass. Quiet when she was fed last, always after the dog. He had perfected silence the way some men perfect a craft with consistency and daily application until it became less a choice than a character trait. He stood in the doorway now and said nothing. He looked at the mud. He looked at the Bible sinking into it. He looked somewhere past Nora's left shoulder at a point in the middle distance that apparently required his full attention, a point that had nothing to do with the girl standing in the lane or the Bible in the puddle or the November wind coming off the ridge. "The whole town knows what you are," Hester said. Her voice was the voice of someone reading from a prepared document. There was no heat in it, no pleasure even, which was the thing that surprised Nora most. She had expected pleasure. She had prepared herself for pleasure. But what she heard instead was the flat delivery of a verdict that had already been decided and rehearsed and was now simply being performed for the record. Nora looked at her aunt. She did not look at Declan. She looked at the woman who had taken her in 3 years ago with the words, "Your mother was my blood, and I won't see her child go to the county," and who had then proceeded to extract from that child every ounce of labor, every hour of wakefulness, every scrap of usefulness she possessed in exchange for an attic room and meals that were always slightly less than enough. She looked at the woman who had called it charity in front of the congregation every Sunday for 3 years and believed the description because it was easier than the other one. "I won't have it under my roof," Hester said. "Not another day." Then she went inside. The door closed. Nora stood in the lane for a long moment. The wind moved through the bare trees on the ridge above the house. A crow called once from somewhere in the gray sky and then went silent, as if even it had nothing useful to add to the proceedings. She bent down and picked her mother's Bible out of the mud. She wiped it on the front of her dress, leaving a smear of red clay across the cotton. She tucked it under her arm. And then, because she had nowhere else to put her hands, she pressed her right hand flat against the outside of her coat over the place where she had stitched a hidden pocket into the lining the previous spring. She had stitched it herself by candlelight in the attic after Hester had gone to bed, using a needle she had borrowed from the sewing kit and thread she had pulled from the hem of an old curtain. She had made the pocket carefully with small tight stitches because it needed to hold something that could not afford to be lost. The notebook was still there. She could feel it through the wool. 63 pages of her mother's handwriting, thin and careful, as the woman herself had been pressed between covers of leather so soft with age that they felt almost like skin. The notebook was the one thing Hester had never known about, the one thing Nora had hidden every day for 3 years, moving it from the loose board beneath the attic floorboards to the coat lining when the weather turned cold and she needed to wear the coat every hour of the day. The notebook was safe. That was what mattered. She turned north and began to walk. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what Nora Whitfield was. She was not a witch. She was not a poisoner, not a practitioner of dark arts, not any of the things that Reverend Caleb Marsh had called her from the pulpit of the Harlan County First Baptist Church. The previous Sunday morning, his voice rising into the rafters with the particular authority of a man who believes that volume is the same as truth. She was a girl who understood plants. Her mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had been the same way. Eleanor had grown up in these mountains in a family that stretched back into the Appalachian Hills for more generations than anyone had bothered to count. And in that family, knowledge of plants was not folk magic or superstition. It was medicine. It was what you had when there was no doctor within 40 miles and the nearest hospital was a 3-hour drive on roads that turned to rivers in spring and ice in winter and mud in every season between. Eleanor had kept a notebook. She had started it when she was younger than Nora and had added to it steadily for 20 years, her handwriting changing from the careful block letters of a girl learning to write to the flowing, slanted script of a woman who had found her voice and settled into it. The notebook held recipes. That was the word Eleanor used for them, recipes, as if healing were simply another form of cooking, which in many ways it was. Chamomile and fennel seed for infant colic, comfrey root for joint pain and inflammation, wild cherry bark and local honey for the deep coughs that came from breathing coal dust, which meant there was never a shortage of patients in Harlan County, feverfew for headaches, elderberry for fever and influenza, yarrow to stop bleeding, golden seal for infection, mullein for the lungs, black cohosh for the complaints that came with being a woman in a body that did not always cooperate, boneset for the bone-deep aching that accompanied the worst fevers. 63 pages, a lifetime of attention. Eleanor had died in 1934 when Nora was 12, and she had left her daughter two things: the notebook and the years of watching and learning that made the notebook legible. Because the notebook was not just a list of ingredients, it was a record of observation. It contained notes about when to harvest and when not to, about which combinations worked and which canceled each other out, about how the same plant could heal in one dose and harm in another. It was a document of a mind that had paid close attention to the world for a very long time, a mind that had understood that the difference between medicine and poison was often only a matter of proportion and timing. Nora had spent 3 years under Hester Pruitt's roof, adding her own notes to every margin. She had treated Hester's infant grandchild for colic using a tea brewed from chamomile and fennel seed that she gathered from the meadow behind the Baptist church and dried on the windowsill of her attic room when Hester was not looking. The child had stopped screaming within an hour. Hester had said nothing about it, which was the closest thing to gratitude her nature allowed. She had treated old Emmett Suttles down the road for the joint pain that had kept him from walking more than 20 feet without stopping, using a compress of comfrey root applied with hands so careful that the old man had closed his eyes and said, soft as a secret, that she had her mother's touch. He had been back at his garden within a week. He had told 3 people. Those 3 people had told others. She had brewed cough syrup from wild cherry bark and sourwood honey that half the children in the county had tasted at one point or another during the long damp winters when the coal dust in the air mixed with the cold and settled in small lungs. Mothers came to the back door of Hester's house for it. They came quietly and they left quickly, because being seen at Hester Pruitt's back door asking for the girl's remedy was not the kind of thing a respectable woman in Harlan County necessarily wanted to advertise. But they came, and their children got better. And for 3 years, this was an arrangement that everyone understood and no one discussed out loud. A kind of collective agreement to benefit from something they were not entirely prepared to name or examine too closely. Until Reverend Marsh's wife collapsed in the Harlan County General Store on a Thursday afternoon in late October of 1937. Dorothea Marsh was a tall woman with good posture and a firm handshake and a quality of contained suffering that most people in Harlan County mistook for dignity. She had been suffering from severe headaches for the better part of a year. Headaches that arrived without warning and lasted for hours, sometimes days, that no amount of aspirin or rest or cold compress could touch, that had a quality of presence to them, as if something inside her skull was asserting itself with increasing insistence. Nora had been treating her. It had started quietly, the way most things started in Harlan County, through a back-channel conversation between women that never needed to be explained to the men. Word had reached Nora that the preacher's wife was suffering. A jar of feverfew tea had been sent past hand to hand through the network of women who knew how these things moved. Then a lavender compress. Then a longer conversation conducted at the Pruitt back door on a Wednesday afternoon, when the Reverend was at a church council meeting in Whitesburg, with Dorothea herself standing in the cold air, looking both grateful and slightly ashamed of the gratitude. For 2 months, the headaches had eased. Dorothea Marsh had told 2 women who had told 4 others that the Whitfield girl had done what no doctor in the county had managed, that she had more of her mother in her than anyone knew, that there was something in those remedies that worked regardless of what one thought about the source. Then the headaches had come back. Not just the same, worse. Behind the eyes now, and different in character, a pressure rather than a pain accompanied by episodes of blurred vision that Dorothea described to Nora as seeing through gauze, as if the world had wrapped itself in something soft and impenetrable. Nora had read the description carefully sitting in her attic room by candlelight after Hester had gone to bed, her mother's notebook open on her knees. She had written in the margin in letters small enough not to be noticed by anyone who happened to look, "These are not the same headaches." She had not known what they were. She had been 15 years old, and she had never been to a school with more than one room, and she had no access to medical texts or trained physicians. But she had known with the certainty of someone who has learned to trust what observation tells her that they were not the same headaches. The quality of the pressure was wrong. The location had shifted. The blurred vision was new. She had said as much carefully to the woman who carried her messages to Dorothea. She had said that the remedy was not working the way it should, and that Mrs. Marsh ought to see a physician, a real one, in Charleston if necessary, because what she was describing was beyond what Nora could address. 2 weeks later, Dorothea Marsh collapsed in the general store. She went down between the canned goods and the dry goods counter, landing hard on the wooden floor. Her eyes rolled back, her arms thrown out to either side like someone trying to catch themselves against a fall that had already happened. Women screamed. Men ran. Someone rode for the doctor in Benham, who arrived 40 minutes later and arranged for the county ambulance to take her to Charleston. She had a tumor. The doctors at the hospital in Charleston would determine it with the kind of precision that required machines and specialized training and the accumulated knowledge of modern medicine. A growth pressing against the structures at the base of her brain, growing slowly for the better part of a year, pressing against things that were not designed to accommodate pressure. Nothing on earth could have stopped it at that stage. The surgeons in Charleston would operate, and Dorothea Marsh would survive, but she would never fully recover, and she would spend the rest of her life in a chair by a window, in a house that smelled of camphor and old wood, the world arriving to her through the gauze that had never fully lifted. No herb, no tincture, no salve, no syrup, no remedy in any notebook in the world could have cured what Dorothea Marsh had. Nora had known it was beyond her. She had said so as clearly as a 15-year-old girl in Harlan County could say such a thing to the wife of the most powerful man in the community. But Reverend Caleb Marsh needed someone to blame. He stood in the pulpit the following Sunday and he pointed. Nora was not there. She had not attended the Harlan County First Baptist Church since she was old enough to make the choice which Hester had always cited as further evidence of the girl's fundamental wrongness. But enough people who had been there described it to enough other people who had not, that by Sunday afternoon, the words had moved through the county the way fever moves through a household room by room, person by person, impossible to stop once it had started. Reverend Marsh had called her a witch. He had called her a practitioner of old mountain dark arts, a girl who mixed poisons and called them medicine, who drew suffering people to her with false promises and interfered with the natural order of God's creation. He had described her notebooks as records of ungodly knowledge, passed down through generations of women who had chosen the darkness over the light. He had spoken about her remedies as a performance of false hope, a counterfeit healing that drew people away from prayer and proper medicine and towards something older and darker and more dangerous. He had spoken for 40 minutes on the subject. He had been afraid. This was the thing that Nora would understand only much later, after enough years had passed to give her the distance to see it clearly. Caleb Marsh had not been a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He had not been malicious in the way of men who enjoy causing harm. He had been a frightened one. His wife had suffered for months. His prayers had not helped her. His authority and his connections and his standing in the community had not helped her. The doctor in Benham had not helped her. But a 15-year-old orphan girl with a dead woman's notebook had made her better, at least for a while, and that had frightened him more than the suffering had, because it meant there were things in the world that operated outside his understanding, outside his authority, outside the framework he had spent his entire adult life constructing and defending. And Reverend Caleb Marsh had built his entire life on the premise that he understood everything that mattered. So he pointed at the girl. And Harlan County, which had trusted his voice for 20 years from that pulpit, turned to look where he was pointing. One by one, the people Nora had helped found reasons not to remember her kindness. The women who had come to the back door for her cough syrup suddenly could not recall doing so. The men who had watched their children recover from the things the doctor had given up on suddenly had other explanations. Old Emmett Suttles, who had said she had her mother's touch, stopped walking past the Prewitt house. The mothers who had pressed her hands and said, "God bless you, child," no longer met her eyes at the general store, finding other directions to look in when she passed. The community closed around itself like a wound closing, excluding what it had decided was the source of infection. By the following Wednesday, Hester Pruitt had found her justification. She had been looking for one. This was something else Nora understood only later. Hester was not a woman who acted without cover. She needed a framework, a reason that sounded righteous before she could do the thing she had been wanting to do for 3 years, which was to be rid of the girl who looked at her with those steady, undeceived eyes, and who had never not once in 3 years behaved as though Hester's self-description was accurate. She had taken in her dead sister's child because the alternative, the county home, the shame of it had been worse than the inconvenience of a girl to work. She had extracted 3 years of labor from that girl and called it shelter. She had called it charity. She had stood in church and described herself as a woman who had sacrificed for family, and she had believed this description because it was easier than the other one, which was that she had taken in a child and used her the way you use a tool, and felt the discomfort of that truth every time Nora looked at her without flinching. The Reverend's sermon gave her what she needed, a name for what she had been housing, a theological framework for the discomfort she felt whenever Nora looked at her with those steady eyes that never seemed to quite believe anything Hester said. A reason finally that sounded righteous enough to be spoken aloud in company, to be written, so to speak, in the public record of Hester Pruitt's self-understanding. So she had carried the girl's things to the lane herself, piece by piece, dropping them in the mud, with the deliberate care of someone performing an act they want witnessed. She had done it in the morning when the neighbors could see. She had stood on the porch in her good coat and delivered her verdict in a flat voice. And behind her, in the shadow of the doorframe, her husband had said nothing. What Declan Pruitt did that night, Nora would not know for 7 years. She would not know that after Hester had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, he had sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the dark, not lighting the lamp, just sitting with his hands flat on the oilcloth and his eyes on the wall, and whatever it was that a man looks at when he is being honest with himself about himself. She would not know that he had gone out to the lane after full dark with a rag from the barn and a tin of the saddle oil he kept for his harness work, and had found her mother's Bible in the place where the mud had dried and stiffened around it, that he had cleaned it carefully and treated the leather with the oil working by lantern light in the barn so Hester would not see, that he had carried it inside and wrapped it in brown paper from the pantry and put it in the back of the cupboard behind the mason jars in the place where Hester never looked. She would not know that he had then sat back down at the kitchen table and written with great effort and much crossing out a note on a piece of paper torn from the back of last year's farm almanac, that he had written it 3 times before he had something he thought was clear enough, that he had then gone upstairs to where Nora's coat hung on the peg outside the attic door and had slipped the folded note into the hidden pocket he had noticed, but never mentioned the one she had stitched into the lining with such careful small stitches. She would not know any of this until Declan Pruitt told her himself 7 years later at the bottom of a staircase in a house that smelled of camphor and old wood. What she did know, what she had discovered the evening before they threw her out, was a folded scrap of paper that had appeared in the hidden pocket of her coat, the pocket she had stitched herself in the lining where the notebook lived. Someone had put it there while she was sleeping, or while she was working, or while her coat was on its peg, and she was somewhere in the house that was not near the peg. She had unfolded it by candlelight in the attic, lying on her stomach on the thin mattress, with the candle close enough to read by. The handwriting was unfamiliar, cramped, and slightly uneven, the hand of someone who did not write often and found the act effortful. Opal Tully, it said, "The ridge above Darnell's Hollow. She knew your mother. That was all. No name, no explanation, no instruction, no indication of who had written it or why or what was expected of her on the basis of this information. Just a name, a location, and a fact that felt in the particular cold of that attic on that night like the most important thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. She knew your mother." Nora had lain there for a lengthy time with the scrap of paper in her hand, listening to the wind move across the roof above her head, and the sound of Hester's snoring from the room below, and the settling of the house around her. She had not allowed herself to speculate about who had put it there, because hope was a thing she had learned to manage carefully, the way you manage a fire in a dry season. You keep it small. You watch it. You do not let it get away from you. But she had folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, separate from the notebook on the other side of the lining where it would not get damp. And in the morning when Hester threw her out, she had walked north. For 3 days she walked. The mountains of Harlan County rose around her like walls, their flanks stripped bare by November, the trees clattering in the wind like something that had lost its covering and not yet found it again. She followed creek beds where she could, because the water led downhill, and downhill meant valleys, and valleys meant slightly less wind and slightly more shelter, and the possibility of finding things to eat along the creek margins. She ate what the season had left. The last of the autumn's wild persimmons, soft and wrinkled, and so sweet they made her back teeth ache, the frost having done to them what frost does to persimmons, which is to transform their bitterness into something approaching candy. Black walnuts cracked between 2 rocks, a patch of chickweed growing near a spring that she ate by the fistful, sitting on her heels in the cold mud, chewing steadily with the focused attention of someone eating not for pleasure but for continuation. She drank from streams so cold they turned her teeth to ice. At night, she burrowed into leaf piles at the base of south-facing rocks, the way her mother's notebook described animals doing in winter, using the insulation of depth in the residual warmth stored in the stone through the day. She shook herself to sleep and was shaking when she woke, and the shaking was actually a comfort because she had read in Eleanor's notebook what it meant when the shaking stopped. She did not cry, not because she was not afraid. She was afraid every hour of every one of those 3 days, with a fear that sat in her chest like swallowed iron and made her breathing shallow and her thoughts jagged and short. But she had learned walking through those mountains that fear was just another kind of weather. It came. You moved through it. You kept walking. You did not pretend it was not there, because pretending was a waste of the energy you needed for walking. On the second day, she found an abandoned hunting camp with half a roof still intact and a rusted tin can she used to boil water from the creek, which tasted of minerals and cold, and faintly of rust, but was at least hot when she drank it. She slept there for a few hours lying on the bare ground with her coat pulled tight, and felt when she woke that she had made a decision, though she could not have named exactly when the decision had happened. She was not going back. Not to Harlan. Not to anyone who had watched what happened and said nothing. Not to a life defined by what Reverend Marsh had said from his pulpit, or what Hester Pruitt needed to believe about herself. Not to the arrangement where she made herself small enough to be tolerated and useful enough to be kept. She was going to Darnell's Hollow. She was going to find the ridge above it. She was going to find Opal Tully. On the third night the storm arrived, she heard it before she saw it. A sound like a freight train moving through the ridge above her, a sustained roar that was not wind exactly, but something wind became when it carried enough ice and intention and had been building for long enough to have real momentum behind it. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in what felt like minutes. The last light went out of the sky as the clouds closed over everything. Nora had been moving along a rocky slope above a creek bed when the sleet began. It came sideways, each drop a small, cold blade stripping the last dead leaves from the trees, and turning every surface to glass within minutes. The rocks became treacherous. The trail, such as it was, became indistinguishable from everything around it. She pulled her coat tighter and kept moving, but her feet had lost sensation, and she was stumbling, more than walking, catching herself on tree trunks, going down on one knee, and pushing back up again, her hands bleeding where they had scraped the frozen ground. Her fingers turned white. Then they turned blue. The shaking stopped. She knew from her mother's notebook what that meant. She had read the entry many times because Eleanor had written it with the kind of emphasis she reserved for the things that could kill you quietly. When the shaking stops, it means the body has made a decision. It has stopped trying to generate heat and started trying to preserve what it has. It is the body giving up on fighting and starting to manage the dying. She knew what it meant, and the knowing was strangely separate from the experience of it, as if she were reading about herself from a slight distance, which was itself another sign of the cold working on her thinking, narrowing it down, slowing it, making everything feel slightly unreal. She went down, not falling exactly. More a slow collapse, her legs giving out against the base of a rock outcropping her back, sliding down the wet stone until she was sitting with her knees drawn up and the sleet coming in at an angle that the rock only partially blocked. She sat there and she understood in a dull, distant way that she was in serious trouble. And that understanding was not accompanied by the urgency it should have been, which was itself the most frightening thing about it. Her thoughts moved like frozen water, slowly, with effort, touching things and sliding away. She thought about her mother's face. The particular blue of the dress Eleanor had been buried in, a blue like the sky in early September, before it fully decided to be autumn. She thought about the way Eleanor's handwriting changed across the 63 pages of the notebook, getting more confident as it went, the letters leaning further forward, as if the woman herself had been leaning into something she was becoming. She saw light. It was at the edge of the trees, maybe 30 yards away through the sleet, in the dark, a soft amber glow that moved slightly the way a lantern moves in a hand. She blinked. It was still there. A figure behind it, or the suggestion of one standing at the tree line in what her half-frozen mind insisted was a blue dress, the specific blue of a September sky. She knew it was not real. She knew that the cold had reached the place in her brain where the difference between real and not real was maintained, and that the maintenance of that difference required warmth and oxygen that she was no longer providing in sufficient quantity, and that what she was seeing was her mind doing the last kind thing it knew how to do, which was to give her something to follow. She crawled toward it anyway, because there was nothing else to do, because the alternative was staying against the rock and letting the body finish its decision, because even a mind that knows it is hallucinating will follow the last light it can see when the last light is all there is. She crawled on hands and knees over frozen ground, her palms leaving blood on the ice where the skin had split. She crawled through the sleet and through the dark and through the roaring of the storm above her in the trees, through the cold that had gotten into her shoulders now and made her arms want to give way. She crawled toward the light at the edge of the trees for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes, because time in that state is not reliable. She crawled into a gap in the rock face. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a girl's shoulders, and it smelled of old wood and mineral water and something faintly sulfurous, and it was dark inside except for the source of the light, which turned out to be not a lantern, and not her mother, and not anything divine. It was a piece of mirror glass no larger than her palm, propped against a broken barrel stave, positioned at some angle that had caught a sliver of moon appearing through a momentary crack in the storm clouds, and was reflecting it back into the cave entrance. The light that had guided her across the frozen ground was a reflection. Not her mother, not a lantern, not a vision or a visitation. A piece of broken mirror in an abandoned cave catching the moon. She lay on the cave floor and looked at it for a long time. She lay there while feeling slowly returned to her hands and her feet in the way that feeling returns, which is to say with considerable pain, the pain of circulation resuming in tissue that had decided circulation was no longer coming. She lay there and breathed and felt her thoughts reassemble themselves from the slow, cold fragments they had become back into something resembling coherence. Then she pulled herself further inside, away from the entrance and the wind, into the dark and the stillness that the rock provided. The cold was still there, but the wind was not. The floor was dry. The rock around her had a quality of stillness that felt almost warm, the way thick stone holds the memory of summer long after summer has gone, the way it absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly and does not forget. She wrapped her arms around herself. She was still alive. That was the sum of everything she knew in that moment, and it was, she thought, enough. She was still alive, and she was out of the wind, and her mother's notebook was still in the hidden pocket of her coat, and the scrap of paper with Opal Tully's name on it was still in the other pocket in the left side of the lining. She slept. When morning came and the storm had passed and pale winter light was entering the cave at a low angle that told her the entrance faced roughly south, Nora Whitfield lay on the floor of what had once been Silas Darnell's moonshining operation and looked up at a ceiling of pale limestone and understood slowly through the returning sensation in her fingers and the gradual reassembly of coherent thought where she was. She had heard of Darnell's Hollow. Most people in Harlan County had. Silas Darnell had run his still up here from 1915 until the revenue men found him in 1920, and the finding had not gone well for Silas, who had been dead of a heart attack before they got him down the mountain, and had not gone well either for his still, which they had destroyed so thoroughly that not much more than rust and memory remained of it. But the cave remained. She sat up and looked at it properly in the thin winter light. It was a hand-dug chamber roughly 30 feet deep and 15 feet wide, with a ceiling high enough to stand upright without stooping. The walls were limestone, the kind that holds temperature the way a root cellar does, absorbing the day's heat and releasing it through the night. A natural spring emerged from a fissure in the far wall, no wider than a man's forearm, and trickled down the stone to collect in a shallow basin that Silas had lined with clay during his years of operation. There were smaller chambers. She could see the openings of them from where she sat, carved or worn into the softer rock on either side of the main space. Storage, she thought, for barrels, for supplies, for the raw materials of a trade that had ended 17 years ago but had left the infrastructure behind. The entrance faced due south. She sat with her back against the cool wall and thought about that. South-facing in the mountains meant direct winter sun. It meant hours of light during the growing season entering at low angles that reached deep inside a space like this. It meant a microclimate significantly warmer than the ridge above, protected from the north winds that came down off the higher elevation with such intention. She thought about the pit greenhouse article, the one she had found in a pile of old magazines at Hester's house, magazines used for starting fires stacked near the wood stove, in a pile that Hester raided every few days for kindling. She had found it on a Saturday afternoon when she had been sent to fetch starting material for the evening fire, and had instead stood in the kitchen reading it with a particular absorption of someone who has found exactly the thing they needed before they knew they needed it. A pit greenhouse, a structure dug into the earth using the stable temperature below the frost line and its insulation using a south-facing glass wall or opening to collect solar radiation, creating a growing environment that stayed above freezing through the worst winters without any additional heat source. Farmers in Minnesota and Vermont were building them to grow food through January. The principle was simple enough to be stated in one sentence: the earth itself was the greenhouse. She had torn the article out carefully, folded it, and hidden it in the notebook. She looked at the chamber around her. at the south-facing entrance, the natural spring providing constant moisture. The deep storage chambers that would maintain a stable temperature far below the frost line. The limestone walls that had spent 1,000 years absorbing and releasing heat according to their own slow schedule, indifferent to seasons. She looked at all of it and felt something shift in her chest that was not yet hope, because she had learned to keep hope at arm's length until it had earned her trust, but was the thing that comes before hope. The recognition of possibility. The sense that what you are looking at might be, if approached correctly and worked with sufficient care, exactly what you need. She reached into the coat lining and drew out her mother's notebook. She opened it to a blank margin near the back, one of the wider margins, on a page that Eleanor had not fully filled. She took the pencil stub she kept tucked into the spine. She began to write. Not remedies this time, not recipes, plans. She spent 2 days in the cave before she climbed the ridge. 2 days learning the space pacing the chambers, finding where the water went and where the light reached at different hours of the day. She ate nothing in those 2 days. She drank from the spring, which was clean and cold and faintly mineral tasting, and she wrote in the margins of her mother's notebook. And she slept when the cold required it, and she woke and wrote more. By the end of the second day, she had 4 pages of notes in her smallest hand. Rough sketches of the chambers with measurements estimated in arm lengths and converted to feet. A list of what she would need. A list of what she already had, which was shorter but not nothing. A list of the plants she knew grew wild on these ridges, organized by light requirement and moisture need, and whether they could be transplanted or would need to be started from seed, and whether the seeds were available now or would have to wait for spring. 40 species. She thought 40 was achievable. She thought reading and rereading the greenhouse article and cross-referencing it with her mother's notes on each plant's growing requirements that the cave could sustain 40 species year-round if she managed the water and the light and the soil carefully. If she paid attention. Paying attention was the thing she was best at. On the third morning, she climbed the ridge. The trail was steep and icy, and she went up it on her hands and knees, in places pulling herself from tree root to exposed rock to frozen ground, breathing hard in the cold air that scoured the back of her throat. The view opened up as she gained elevation, the hollow falling away below her, the ridge line across from her, catching the morning light, the mountains stretching away in every direction, with the particular quality of winter mountains, stripped down to their essential shapes, nothing soft or obscured. She was looking for a cabin. She found it, an hour after sunrise, a small structure, on a south-facing bald where the trees gave way entirely, and the view stretched 30 miles in every direction, ridge after ridge of mountains going blue in the distance. The cabin was old but solid, the logs fitted with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about weather and had the skill to act on that thinking. The chinking between the logs was recent, redone perhaps in the last few years. Smoke came from the chimney in a thin, straight column that meant a controlled fire, not a careless one. Nora stood at the edge of the clearing and waited. She had learned growing up in these mountains that you did not approach a mountain person's cabin unannounced. You stopped at the edge of the clearing and you let yourself be seen, and you waited for an invitation, because mountain people had various ways of dealing with uninvited visitors, and not all of them were hospitable. The door opened before she had decided whether to announce herself. The woman in the doorway was old, not old in the way of people who have aged and show the signs of it, but old in the way of certain rocks and certain trees. Old, as in fundamentally of this landscape, so thoroughly a part of the mountain that it was difficult to imagine the mountain without her. Her face was creased deeply in all directions, the creases of a face that had spent 70-some years in the weather, reading it, responding to it, outlasting it season after season. Her eyes were the pale blue of a sky that has thought about being gray and decided against it, a color that looked in the winter morning light, very clear and very direct. She looked at Nora for a moment, at the torn coat, the split boot on one side and the bare foot on the other, the foot that had been bare since the morning they threw her out, wrapped now in strips of petticoat that had kept it from freezing but had not kept it dry. At the mud on the dress and the hands that had never fully warmed since the night on the frozen ground. At the notebook clutched under one arm and the Bible under the other, both held with the grip of someone who has decided that these two things are not getting lost regardless of what happens to everything else. She looked at all of it without expression, without the pity that Nora had been dreading and the judgment she had been preparing herself for. Your mama would have done the exact same thing, she said. Her voice was low and even, the voice of someone who has spent a lifetime saying exactly what she meant and has learned that more words rarely improve on fewer. Come inside, she said. Shura came inside. She sat at Opal Tully's kitchen table and drank a cup of sassafras tea and ate a piece of cornbread and did not speak for a long time because she had not spoken to another human being in 3 days. and the machinery of conversation had temporarily gone quiet inside her like a mill that had been shut down and needed time to start up again. Opal did not push her. She sat on the other side of the table with her own cup and looked out the window at the long view of mountains as if she had all the time in the world and no particular expectations about how this morning was going to go, which Nora would come to understand was simply the way Opal Tully had always moved through life without urgency about things that would happen in their own time. After a while, when the tea had warmed her through and the cornbread had settled the hollow place in her stomach that 3 days of wild persimmons and chickweed had not fully addressed, Nora set down the cup and opened the notebook. She turned to the sketch of the cave she had drawn in the 2 days of planning and laid it on the table between them. She explained what she was thinking. She spoke for a long time, longer than she expected, because the thinking she had done in those 2 days in the cave had been thorough and detailed, and once it began coming out, it kept coming, each part connecting to the next. The way the notes in the notebook connected each piece of knowledge, supporting the ones beside it. The south-facing exposure, the spring, the stable temperature in the deep chambers, the greenhouse principle, and how the cave was a natural version of it. The species she thought could be transplanted and which would need to be started from seed. The water management system she had sketched out using stone channels to direct the spring flow toward the growing areas. The shelving structure she planned to build from Silas Darnell's abandoned barrel staves. The mirror glass she had noticed scattered near the entrance, fragments of what had been a full-length mirror that could be positioned to reflect light deeper inside than it would reach on its own. She talked about the notebook and what was in it. She talked about her mother. Opal Tully listened to all of it without interrupting. She listened with the quality of attention that Nora would come to associate specifically with her, a quality of receiving rather than waiting, as if what she was hearing was going somewhere inside her and being placed carefully alongside other things she knew. When Nora finished, the old woman looked at the sketch for a long moment. She reached out and touched the drawing with one finger, the way you touch something you want to understand through your hands as well as your eyes. Then she looked up. "Your mama had this in her," she said. "This exact thing. The seeing of what a thing could be before it is what it could be." She paused. "You're going to need better boots," she said. Nora looked down at her feet, at the left foot wrapped in strips of petticoat, the right foot in the split boot stuffed with dried leaves for insulation. Something that had been sealed shut in her chest for 3 years, maybe longer, maybe since the morning of 1934, when she had stood beside her mother's grave in the cold November rain and understood for the first time what alone actually meant something cracked slightly. Not open, not yet, but cracked. The way limestone cracks before the water gets in and begins its slow, patient work. She kept her face still. "Yes," she said. "I know. The first thing Nora Whitfield built in the cave was a door, not a real door. She had no hinges, no lumber, no tools beyond a rusted hatchet she had found behind one of Silas Darnell's storage chambers, its handle cracked, but its head still solid, and a hunting knife with a cracked handle that had been in her coat pocket since the summer before kept there, the way mountain people kept knives as a matter of habit and practicality. What she built was a barrier flat stone stacked and mortared with a mixture of clay and moss she packed in wet and let freeze solid in the November temperatures, leaving a gap at the top for ventilation and a narrow passage at the bottom that she could squeeze through on her hands and knees. It took 4 days. By the time she finished, her hands were cut in a dozen places from the stone edges, the cuts too cold to bleed properly, and her knees had bruised through to something deeper than the skin. But the wind no longer came in. The temperature inside the main chamber, which she measured by feel and by the behavior of the spring water, and by the way her own breath no longer clouded as visibly climbed by what she estimated to be 10 degrees. 10 degrees when you are living in a cave in Harlan County in December of 1937 is the difference between enduring and not enduring. She allowed herself one moment of satisfaction standing back and looking at the stone barrier in the thin afternoon light. Then she went back to work. The first winter was a sustained negotiation with starvation. She foraged what the frozen ground gave up, dock root and cattail from the creek margins dug with bleeding hands, when the ice at the creek edge was thin enough to break without plunging her arm through. Dried berries she found on south-facing slopes where the birds had not yet stripped the branches clean. Shelf mushrooms growing from the underside of a fallen hemlock, which she boiled and ate, even knowing they would not do much for the hunger, because they were something, and something was what she had to work with. She set snares from strips of her own petticoat along the game trails above the hollow. She had read the instructions for snaring in a trapping almanac she had found in the attic at Hester's house, and had memorized because she had always memorized things that seemed like they might someday matter. Most mornings she found nothing. Some mornings she found evidence that something had taken the bait and sprung the snare and departed entirely, leaving only the sprung wire and whatever contempt a rabbit is capable of expressing. Twice in December, she found rabbits. She cleaned them with hands that had stopped trembling only because they had gone past trembling into a kind of determined numbness, and she boiled every scrap, the bones and the scraps of hide and everything else, into a broth she stretched across 2 days, drinking it slowly from the tin can that had become her primary cooking vessel. January was the worst month. 5 days without food in the middle of January, when the temperature outside the cave dropped far enough that the spring water ran slower than usual, as if even the underground water was conserving itself, and the stone walls radiated a cold that went through her blanket and through the old burlap from Silas Darnell's abandoned supplies that she had folded for extra insulation and into her bones like a slow, sustained intention. She lay in the deepest chamber, which was the warmest by 2 or 3 degrees, and she did not move more than necessary, and she read her mother's notebook from the beginning to the end and started again. She read it because Eleanor had taught her that the mind needed to be occupied when the body could not act, that an unoccupied mind in a desperate situation was a danger to itself, and because reading Eleanor's handwriting was the closest thing to conversation she had. She read the entries she knew by heart and felt them differently in this context, the context of actually needing them, actually using them the way you feel a map differently when you are lost than when you are simply studying geography. On the 6th day, she crawled to the entrance passage and found a rabbit in a snare she had set and entirely forgotten in a stand of cedar at the eastern edge of the hollow. The rabbit was frozen solid. She brought it inside and thawed it slowly by the fire and cleaned it with hands that shook badly now, and boiled every part of it, every bone and every scrap into a broth she drank over 2 days. She would say years later to anyone who asked about those early months that it was the finest meal of her entire life. She was not speaking figuratively. But even in those weeks when the body was managing on minimum and the mind was narrowed down to the next task and the next hour and the next meal Nora was planning, the notebook was always open somewhere near her, not just her mother's entries, but the margins where she had added her own observations in the attic at Hester's, and the later pages she had been filling since she arrived at the cave, pages that now held sketches and measurements and calculations and pencils that she checked and rechecked because she had no one to verify them, and so had to be her own verification. The Pit Greenhouse article was the core of it. She had read it so many times that she could recite whole sections from memory, which she sometimes did quietly to herself in the dark of the deepest chamber, partly to keep her thinking sharp, and partly because the sound of her own voice was the only human voice she had access to, and there was something in hearing it that kept her tethered. The principle was not complicated. Below the frost line, the Earth maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round, somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees, depending on location and depth. A structure dug into that zone is naturally insulated against both summer heat and winter cold. Add a south-facing opening to collect solar radiation, and you have a growing environment that stays above freezing through January in Minnesota, through February in Vermont, through the worst of a Harlan County winter, without any additional heat source whatsoever. The cave was not just a pit greenhouse. It was a pit greenhouse that had been refining itself for 10,000 years, making adjustments season by season, settling into its own optimal configuration through a process that made human engineering look hurried. The main chamber sat roughly 8 feet below the surface grade at its deepest point. The natural spring meant constant moisture, which moderated temperature swings the way all moisture does, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it slowly, dampening extremes. The south-facing entrance admitted direct sun from mid-morning through mid-afternoon during the growing season. The limestone walls absorbed that solar energy and released it slowly through the night, so that the temperature swing between midday and midnight was far smaller inside the cave than outside. The deep storage chambers that Silas Darnell had carved for his barrels maintained a temperature she calculated from the behavior of water in her own skin and the way certain foods kept or did not keep of roughly 55 degrees year-round, cold enough to slow decomposition, warm enough to sustain root growth and dormant plant metabolism. It was, she wrote in the notebook during that long January, almost as though someone knew what I would need here and prepared it in advance. She crossed that out. Then she wrote it again because crossing it out had felt like a kind of ingratitude toward whatever agency, geological or otherwise, had made this place exactly what she needed. Spring came late that year, not truly spring until mid-April, when the redbuds appeared on the south-facing slopes, like something the mountain had decided to offer after a particularly hard winter, and the creek below the hollow ran brown and fast with snowmelt. Nora had been in the cave for 4 months. She was 16 years old, and she weighed less than she had weighed at 13, and she was stronger than she had ever been in her life, which was a paradox. She did not spend time examining because there was too much work to do. She had spent February and March preparing. The barrel staves from Silas's abandoned supplies became shelving, rough but functional, tiered to maximize the light that entered through the south-facing entrance at different times of day, positioned so that the plants with the highest light requirements could be placed at the levels where the reflected and direct light was strongest. She chinked the gaps between the staves with moss to retain the moisture in the soil. She shaped flat stones into channels and packed the joints with clay to direct water from the spring basin toward the growing areas in a controllable flow, so she could increase or decrease the moisture to different sections based on what the plants in those sections needed. The mirror glass was the piece she was most pleased with. There had been perhaps 24 pieces of it scattered near the entrance, fragments of what had been a full-length mirror that Silas had apparently kept for some purpose she could not determine and did not spend much time trying to. She collected every piece she could find and spent 3 evenings positioning them carefully against the stone wall at angles she determined purely by observation, shifting each piece a fraction and watching where the reflected light moved on the cave floor and walls, adjusting until she had extended the zone of usable growing light by nearly 6 feet beyond where the direct light from the entrance reached. She was proud of the mirrors. She did not tell anyone about them for a long time because there was no one to tell, but she thought about them often, and the thinking had the quality of quiet satisfaction that she was beginning to understand was what passed for joybroom in a life conducted largely in one's own company. When the ground thawed, she went to work on the plants. She knew these ridges. 3 years of ranging the margins of Harlan County gathering herbs for her remedies under the cover of whatever errand Hester had sent her on had given her an intimate knowledge of every south-facing slope and damp hollow and stream margin within 4 miles. She knew where the golden seal grew thick on the north-facing banks under the old beeches, its distinctive broad leaves and yellow roots waiting in the shade. She knew the ginseng patches which she had never harvested, only observed year after year, counting the distinctive red berry clusters each autumn and noting in the notebook which plants were old enough to be useful and which were still years away. She knew the elderberry stands along the creek margins, the yarrow meadows behind the abandoned Cutter farm, the mullein colonies in every rocky clearing where the soil was thin and the sun was strong, the wild cherry trees on the high ridges. She transplanted with the care of a surgeon and the patience of someone who understands that the difference between a plant that survives transplanting and one that does not is almost always in the handling of the roots. Each plant came up with as much root intact as she could manage, wrapped immediately in damp moss that she kept wet with spring water carried in the tin can. She worked in the early morning when the air was cool and the plants were not yet stressed. By midday, heat moved quickly and replanted immediately, pressing the roots into soil she had prepared in the cave chambers by carrying forest floor material inside by the bucket, working uphill with loaded containers until her arms ached to the shoulder. She learned through observation and failure what each plant needed. Ginseng and golden seal went into the dim back chambers where temperature and moisture mimicked the deep forest shade of their native habitat. They went in skeptically, the way ginseng always behaves when disturbed, withdrawing into itself for weeks before showing any signs of adaptation. Nora checked them every morning and every evening, adjusting moisture levels, watching for the fine root hairs that would indicate the plant had decided to stay. Elderberry and mullein went near the entrance where the light was strongest. Yarrow on the shelves where it could catch the reflected light from the mirrors. Wild cherry in the central chamber where the temperature was most stable. Black cohosh, which was one of the most important entries in Eleanor's notebook for women's complaints, went through 3 failed transplantings before she understood the drainage problem, that it needed the moisture but not standing water, and that she had to build up the growing bed by 2 inches exactly so the roots sat above the water table. She noted every failure, not with frustration exactly, but with the focused attention of someone who understands that a failure is just a question that has been answered. She wrote the failures in the notebook with the same care she gave the successes, because Eleanor had taught her that you learn more from what does not work than from what does, and because someday someone else might read these notes and save themselves the cost of learning the same lesson twice. By midsummer of 1938, she had 43 species growing in the cave. She stood at the entrance one evening in July and looked at what she had made, and the light was coming in at the low summer angle that made the limestone walls glow faintly amber, and the shelves of plants were green and warm and growing, and the smell of the place was something she had never encountered anywhere else: mineral water and leaf mold, and a dozen different green growing things, all contributing to a compound fragrance that she associated ever after with a particular feeling of a thing going right. She allowed herself, standing there in the amber light, 1 minute of something that was not cautious hope, but actual joy, uncomplicated, unguarded joy, the kind she had not felt since before her mother died. Then she went to check the ginseng. It was around this time that Opal Tully began coming down the ridge. The old woman had been aware of Nora since the morning she had appeared at the cabin door. She had said little that first day beyond the practical. The boots she pressed on Nora were 2 sizes too large, but sound stuffed with wool rags to fill the gap. And they kept her feet dry through the rest of the winter, which was more than the split boot had been doing. She had sent Nora back down the ridge that first afternoon with cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth and a jar of last summer's sourwood honey, and the statement, delivered without ceremony, that she would come down herself when the weather allowed. She came for the first time in March when the snow was still on the ground, but the worst of the cold had broken, picking her way down the steep trail with a walking stick in a pace that suggested she had been navigating this mountain since before the trail existed and found the trail, if anything, somewhat redundant. She stood in the entrance of the cave and looked at what Nora had done. The stone barrier mortared with clay and moss. The shelving built from barrel staves tiered and moss-lined. The mirror glass positioned along the walls with evident care and evident thought. The spring water channeled through clay-packed stone grooves toward the growing areas. The notebook open on a flat stone that served as a work table covered in Nora's dense marginal writing. She looked at it all for a long time, turning slowly, taking in each element with the attention of someone who is not just seeing, but understanding. Then she said, "Your mama would have done the exact same thing." It was the same thing she had said at the cabin door 3 months before. But Nora understood, hearing it the second time in this different context, that it was not a repetition. It was the old woman's way of saying something that mattered enough to say in 2 different registers, once for the girl and once for the work, and the meaning was slightly different. Each time at the cabin door, it had been about who Nora was here in the cave. It was about what Nora had done, and the distinction mattered. Opal Tully did not teach Nora herbalism from the beginning. This was the first thing Nora understood about their arrangement, and it was important to understand it correctly. There were things Opal knew that Nora did not, specific practical things, the kind of knowledge that only comes from 50 years of daily practice on a particular mountain with particular plants in particular conditions. But Nora was not a student arriving at a subject from ignorance. She was a practitioner arriving at a conversation, and Opal treated her accordingly, which was one of the most important things anyone had ever done for her. Opal taught her to harvest golden seal under a waning moon, when the plant's energy had drawn down from the leaves and concentrated in the root, making the root more potent for its medicinal purposes. She taught her to judge that potency by the depth of yellow in the freshly cut root. The brighter and deeper the yellow, the more berberine it contained, and berberine was what made golden seal effective against infection. She taught her to make proper tinctures, not the simple water infusions Nora had been brewing from Eleanor's instructions, but extractions in corn whiskey that preserved the active compounds for months and concentrated them far more efficiently than water alone could manage. She showed her how to pack a mason jar with fresh plant material, cover it completely with spirit, and seal it away from light for 6 weeks, shaking it every few days so that the alcohol had constant contact with fresh surfaces of the plant material and could pull out every useful compound it contained. She taught her to render salve from bear fat and beeswax, the fat kept pure and clean in the cold storage chamber. The beeswax from a colony that had been living in a hollow tree above the cabin for as long as Opal could remember. Nora's mother had made salve, but with commercial lard that went rancid in summer. The bear fat stayed sweet through the hottest August, and the beeswax gave the salve a quality of skin contact that lard could not match. Nora showed Opal the mirror system and watched the old woman study it without comment for several minutes, moving from one mirror to the next, tracing the angles with her eyes, understanding the geometry. She showed her the irrigation channel and the tiered shelving and the way she had organized the planting. She showed her the page in the notebook where she had recorded the temperature in each chamber at different times of day across the 4 months of winter and the calculations she had made from those readings about what would grow where and when. Opal looked at the temperature records for a long time. Then she touched one of the ginseng plants in the back chamber, the largest of the ones Nora had transplanted in April. Its leaves now a deep and settled green that indicated a plant that had made its peace with its new environment. Wild ginseng took 6 or 7 years to reach useful maturity in the wild. This plant, transplanted as a 3-year root, had been in the cave for 4 months and was visibly, measurably larger than when it arrived. She shook her head slowly. "I believe you've done something nobody in these mountains has ever thought to do before," she said. Nora looked at the ginseng. "I just gave it what it needed," she said. Opal looked at her with those pale blue eyes that missed nothing. "That's all anything ever needs," she said. "The trouble is most people don't know what that is. Or they know, and they won't take the trouble." It was in one of those early sessions in the long summer of 1938, when the cave was green and growing and Opal came down the ridge 3 or 4 times a week, that the old woman told her something she had not known. They were sitting at the cave entrance in the late afternoon, the light going golden and low on the ridge above Opal, with her walking stick across her knees and Nora with the notebook open in her lap. They had been talking about Eleanor the way they sometimes did, in the careful way that people talk about the dead when they are trying to understand rather than simply remember. Opal had known Eleanor as a young woman before Nora was born, had taught her some of what she knew, and the conversation about Eleanor had a quality that nothing else in Nora's life had, which was the quality of her mother being present in the room through someone else's remembering. Your mama had a garden once, Opal said. Not like this, smaller, in town. Nora looked up from the notebook. She built it in the lot behind the Whitfield house, Opal said. The year before you were born, medicinal plants same as these. She had it going for 2 seasons. People came to her the same way they come to you now. Nora waited. The Reverend at the time was a younger Caleb Marsh and a more frightened one, Opal said. He got the congregation worked up about it the same way he got them worked up about you. Called it the same things. Your mama took the garden down herself before they could destroy it. Packed up what she could save and moved out to the edge of the county. She never built another one in town. She never talked about it. I don't think she ever stopped grieving it. The light moved across the cave entrance. A thrush called once from somewhere in the trees below and was answered by nothing. She didn't tell me, Nora said. She didn't want you carrying it, Opal said. She thought if you didn't know, it couldn't hurt you the same way. She thought she was protecting you. Nora looked at the notebook in her lap, at her mother's handwriting running through the pages, the careful, unhurried script of a woman who had put her knowledge somewhere it could not be taken from her, somewhere it could survive what had been done to the garden. She understood sitting there that the notebook had not been just a record. It had been Eleanor's refusal to let what had been destroyed stay destroyed, her way of ensuring that what she had learned would outlast what had been done to her. Her answer to a man who had stood in a pulpit and pointed. She thought about Reverend Marsh, about the way he had stood in that same pulpit 20-some years later and pointed at Eleanor's daughter. He has done this before, she thought, to my mother before me. And she did not let it stop her entirely, even if she had to change her form. Neither will I. She closed the notebook. She went back to work. They fell into a rhythm through that summer and into the autumn and through the following year. Opal came down 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes bringing food, sometimes not. She brought knowledge the way she brought everything else, without ceremony, without hierarchy, in the course of doing rather than informal instruction. She would be examining a shelf of plants and say something like, you want to harvest the elderberry before the first frost, not after the frost changes the composition of the berries in ways that matter for the medicine, and then she would move on to the next thing, leaving the information lying there for Nora to pick up and examine and add to the accumulating store. Nora picked up everything. She wrote it in the margins of the notebook in her smallest hand, compressing observations and techniques into the spaces available, fitting new knowledge around old, the way you fit stones in a wall, each piece shaped by what surrounds it, each piece necessary to the integrity of the whole. In the evenings after Opal had gone back up the ridge, Nora ordered books. She had begun selling ginseng in the summer of 1938. The large roots she had transplanted were maturing faster than wild roots. Just as Opal had noted with quiet amazement, and ginseng commanded a reliable price from the buyer in Harlan, who shipped it north to buyers who cared more about what it was than where it had come from. It was slow money and careful money, because she harvested only what was ready and replanted what she could. But it was enough, combined with the trading she did for remedies, to maintain a small account at the general store in Avarts, which was the closest town, and which she reached by a 4-mile trail she could walk in under 2 hours. The books came from a shop in Lexington. She had found the address in a copy of a farm journal that Opal kept for the almanac pages in the back. She ordered botany texts, pharmacology surveys, agricultural handbooks, plant chemistry guides, anything that connected to what she was doing and might tell her more precisely why it worked or how to do it better. The bookseller, a woman named Lucinda Cross, who included brief handwritten notes with each order, began anticipating what Nora would want next, and occasionally included an additional title with a note that said simply, thought this might be useful, which it invariably was. Nora read them by lamplight after the day's work was done, lying on her stomach in the deep chamber and with the lamp close, connecting the science to the practice, the way you connect the names on a map to the terrain you have already walked. Eleanor's notebook told her that wild cherry bark reduced coughing in patients with cold lung. The pharmacology text told her that wild cherry contained prunicin, a compound that converted in small quantities during digestion, and that the resulting compounds suppressed the cough reflex without depressing respiration, the way commercial cough suppressants did. The chemistry explained why the remedy worked. The notebook told her how much was safe. She needed both. She always needed both. Then came the news from Harlan County. Opal brought it on a Tuesday morning in early October of 1940. Matter of fact in the way she delivered all information sitting on the flat rock outside the cave entrance that had become her habitual seat, peeling an apple with a small knife in the so practiced way of someone who has peeled a great many apples and sees no reason to hurry. Word had got around, she said. Not locally, not in Avarts, but further south in the county, in the hollows around Bledsoe and Golston, and down toward the Virginia line. People were talking about a woman in Darnell's Hollow who could cure what ailed you. Nora was transplanting a division of black cohosh near the entrance and did not stop working. What kind of people, she said. Sick ones, Opal said, and there went on peeling the apple. The first came at the end of October. A man named Harlan Burke, a coal miner from Bledsoe, who had been off the job for 3 weeks with a cough so severe it had cracked 2 of his ribs, brought up the steep trail by his wife and his oldest son, who held him under the arms on the steep sections, because Burke himself was using all his available capacity just to keep moving. Nora examined him. She listened to his chest the way her mother had taught her, ear pressed flat against his back, in the position that gave the clearest picture of what was happening in the lower lobes, hearing the wet crackling that meant fluid and inflammation, but not yet the fixed dullness that meant consolidation. She read the color of his skin and the character of his cough and the quality of his breathing, the information from each sense combining into an assessment that was not guesswork, but the product of years of accumulated observation. She gave him a syrup of mullein wild cherry bark and a third ingredient, her mother's notebook called lungwort, which she had been cultivating in the dim back chamber for 2 years, and which the pharmacology text had confirmed contained compounds with genuine bronchodilating properties. She told his wife how to administer it. She told her what to watch for. She told her to come back in 10 days if he was not improving. He was back at work in 4 days. Word moved through the hollows the way water moves through limestone, slowly at first finding every available crack, and then all at once when enough cracks had been found. A mother came from Cobb Creek with a toddler burning with fever, the child's skin dry and hot, in the way that Nora had learned to associate with the beginning of crisis, the fever not yet breaking, but close to the line where it stopped being the body's defense and started being the body's enemy. She treated the child through the night with elderberry syrup and yarrow tea, sitting on the cave floor with the toddler in her lap, while the mother dozed against the wall, checking the child's temperature with her palm and her lips every half hour, adjusting the yarrow concentration. When the fever climbed above the threshold, she carried in her mind from Eleanor's notes. The fever broke at dawn. The little girl opened her eyes and said, "Mama," in the voice of a child who has been somewhere frightening and has found the way back. Nora handed her to the mother and went outside and stood in the gray morning light and breathed carefully for a while, doing nothing else, just breathing. Then she went back in mind and wrote down exactly what she had done and what had worked and what she would do differently next time. By 1942, she had expanded. With the help of 3 men whose families she had treated, men who arrived one Saturday morning with tools and the kind of wordless mountain purposefulness that meant they had discussed this among themselves and made a decision and were not looking for permission or praise. She carved 2 additional chambers into the soft limestone of the cave wall. The work took 6 Saturdays. The men came and went without being asked twice, and Nora fed them at midday from what she had, which was never enough but was offered completely, and at the end of the 6th Saturday the new chambers were finished. Nearly 1,000 square feet of growing space. She built the workshop near the entrance, a frame structure of rough sawn boards that a sawyer from Bledsoe had milled in exchange for a year's worth of chest salve for his wife's arthritis. A long pine table ran the length of one wall. Above it, shelving held hundreds of glass jars, each labeled in Nora's small, precise hand, with the contents, the harvest date, and the recommended use and dosage. She had developed a drying system using the natural upward draft through the cave's ventilation crevices, hanging bundles of harvested herbs in the warm airflow, so they dried quickly and evenly, without losing the volatile compounds to excessive heat. The war came. She had known it was coming, in the way that people who pay attention to large events always know such things, before the official announcements, reading the shape of the world in the newspapers that arrived at the Evarts General Store 3 days late, and in the conversations of men at the Crossroads store whose brothers in Europe had stopped writing as frequently. When it arrived in Harlan County as absence. The young doctors went first, then the older ones who volunteered. The county health office issued a statement that was essentially an acknowledgement that remote mountain communities would need to manage with what they had for the duration. What the communities around Darnell's Hollow had was Nora Whitfield. She worked 16-hour days, rising before dawn to tend the plants, beginning the day's medicine preparation As the light came into the entrance, seeing patients through the morning and early afternoon returning to cultivation and preparation in the late afternoon reading and recording by lamplight until past midnight. She existed in a state of sustained, purposeful exhaustion that was, she recognized, not entirely unlike the state of the cave itself, always working, always producing, always moving toward the next thing. She trained women. This was the work she had not fully anticipated, and that became in some ways as important as the medicine itself. She began with the wives and mothers, who came most often, teaching them the simpler preparations: how to make elderberry syrup, how to brew a proper yarrow infusion for fever, how to prepare the chest poultice of mustard seed and eucalyptus that open congested lungs in children. She taught them carefully, making them repeat the process back to her, insisting on precision with quantities, because the difference between therapeutic and harmful was often only a matter of proportion. They carried the knowledge back to their hollows. They taught their neighbors. A network spread across 3 counties that had no formal name and no organizational structure, just women who knew things and passed them to other women who needed to know things, the way knowledge had always traveled in these mountains, through kinship and trust and the slow accumulation of shared experience. Then came the morning she found the cave destroyed. It was a Tuesday in March of 1943, before full light, when she came down from the cabin above, where she had spent the night nursing a patient too sick to be moved. She came through the entrance passage and lit the lamp and stood still. Half the shelving on the east wall had been pulled down. Jars were broken on the floor, their contents scattered, the careful labels she had written face down in the mess. 3 of the growing beds near the entrance had been torn up, the plants pulled out and thrown against the wall. She stood in the middle of it and held the lamp and did not move for a full minute. Then she set the lamp down carefully on the pine table, which had not been touched, and she knelt on the floor and looked closely at what remained and what was gone. The back chambers were untouched. The ginseng was untouched. The tinctures in the deep storage were untouched. Whoever had done this had worked fast, and in the front chambers, only doing visible damage. Theatrical damage, the kind meant to be seen and felt rather than the kind meant to be permanent. She knew who had done it. Not with certainty, not the kind you could speak aloud in a room with other people, but with the particular knowledge that comes from paying attention to human beings the way you pay attention to plants, watching what they need and what they fear and how those 2 things drive behavior. Silas Marsh Jr. was 19 years old and the image of his father, not physically, but in the architecture of his interior, built on the same fear of what he could not control and the same habit of reaching for authority when the fear got loud enough. She had seen him twice in Evarts, watching her from across the road with an expression that was trying to be contempt, but was underneath something considerably more uncomfortable. He had done what his father had taught him in the way that fathers teach, without teaching, by example and atmosphere, in the daily demonstration of what a man does when the world does not arrange itself according to his understanding of it. She did not go to the sheriff. She did not tell Opal. She cleaned the cave herself, spending the rest of that day and the next on her knees on the floor, salvaging what could be salvaged and composting what could not. She rebuilt the shelving with boards from the workshop. She replanted the torn beds from rootstock she had kept in the deep chamber, precisely because she had always understood that redundancy was a form of wisdom. 3 weeks of work to restore what an hour of fear had destroyed. She worked in silence, and she did not speak of it to anyone, and she continued her work exactly as she had before, without adjustment, without acknowledgement, as if it had been a weather event rather than an act of human malice. Word got around anyway. It always did in the mountains. People heard that someone had broken into the cave and torn the place apart, and that the mountain doctor had put it back together without saying a word about it to anyone, and had kept on working as if it had never happened. The story moved through the hollows with a different quality than the usual news, slower and more careful, the way people move around something they find themselves respecting against their expectations. They started calling her the woman who doesn't break. Nora never used the name herself, but she wrote it in the margin of the notebook, small at the bottom of a page of plant records, and drew a single line under it. Opal Tully died in the winter of 1943. Nora found her on a Thursday morning in early December, climbing the ridge at first light to bring the old woman a jar of the boneset infusion she had been taking for the joint pain that had worsened with the cold. The cabin was quiet in the way that cabins are not usually quiet when someone is inside. The stove had gone cold. The door was not latched. Opal was in her rocking chair by the window that looked out over the 30-mile view of mountains. She was sitting upright, her hands folded in her lap, and the cup of sassafras tea on the table beside her was half finished. Her eyes were closed. She looked entirely peaceful. She looked like a woman who had decided to stop and rest, and had found the resting so complete and satisfying that she had stayed. Nora sat on the floor beside the chair for a long time. Outside the window, the mountains went on, ridge after ridge. In the cold morning light, the same view Opal had looked at every morning for 40 years, the view she had chosen and stayed with, and known in every season and every weather. It occurred to Nora that there were worse things than ending in a chair looking at something you had loved your whole life. She buried Opal on the ridge at the edge of the bald, in the ground that was hard, but not yet fully frozen, digging through the afternoon with a mattock from the barn. She dug deep the way her mother had taught her, deep enough that the ground would not heave in spring, deep enough to be respectful of the person you are laying down. She planted wild bergamot on the grave. It was the plant Opal had loved most, the one she always stopped beside on the trail to smell, the one she had told Nora smelled like something that had decided to be cheerful regardless of the circumstances it found itself in. Nora stood at the grave in the late afternoon with her hands at her sides and the mountains going blue in the failing light all around her. She did not cry, not because she was not grieving. She was grieving with a completeness that surprised her, a grief that was not only for the old woman herself, but for the mother it brought back and for all the other losses that had accumulated like sediment over the years, pressing down on whatever was underneath. She was grieving for all of it at once, which was both more and less than grieving for one thing at a time. But she had learned in 6 years on that mountain that grief and work were not opposites. That grief was something you carried in your hands while you worked, not something you set down first. That the world did not pause for grief, and that the work did not pause for grief, and that grief itself, if you let it, became part of the work. She had 400 patients across 3 counties who needed their medicines prepared before the worst of winter arrived. She went back down the ridge. She went back to work. The morning they came up the mountain, Nora heard them before she saw them. She was in the deep chamber checking the ginseng by lamplight, in the way she did every morning, regardless of season, moving the lamp slowly along the row of roots and reading each plant, the way a doctor reads a patient color and posture and the quality of new growth at the crown. The ginseng had been in the cave for 6 years now. The largest roots were approaching a size she had never seen in wild plants, accelerated by the stable temperature and the consistent moisture and the careful management she gave each one. And she had begun to think that what was happening in these chambers was not just horticulture, but something closer to what the pharmacology text called controlled cultivation, a thing distinct from wild harvesting in ways that were beginning to interest the part of her mind that never fully stopped working, even when the rest of her was doing something else. She heard footsteps on the trail. Not one person. Several. Moving slowly, the irregular rhythm of people unaccustomed to the grade, stopping and starting in the way of lowland people on mountain trails. People who had not grown up walking slopes like this and who were learning in the moment what their knees thought about it. She put down the lamp and went to the entrance passage and squeezed through and stood outside in the January morning. The sky was the particular white of a sky that has not decided yet whether to snow, holding its options open, committing to nothing. The trees were bare, and the trail was visible for a quarter-mile below where it switched back up through the second-growth hardwoods. She could see them clearly. 4 people. A man in front, older, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose knees were giving him trouble on the grade, but who had decided the trouble was beside the point of why he was here. Behind him, 2 men she recognized, vaguely faces from the Evarts Crossroads store. Behind them, a woman in a dark coat. Nora stood at the cave entrance and watched them come. She recognized Declan Pruitt while they were still 200 yards away. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair fully white now, and he moved like a man carrying something heavy that was not in his hands. The woman in the dark coat she identified as Winifred Cope, who had been the school teacher in Harlan for 20 years, and who Nora remembered as someone who had always looked at her with an expression of complicated sympathy that she had never quite known what to do with. They climbed the last steep section and stopped at the edge of the clearing in front of the cave entrance. None of them spoke immediately. They stood getting their breath back and looking at the cave, at the framed entry structure, at the shelves of drying herbs visible through the opening, at the woman standing in front of it all. Nora looked at them. She did not speak first. Declan Pruitt took off his hat. He held it in both hands in front of him, which was a gesture so old and so specifically Appalachian in its meaning that it required no translation. It meant, I am here without armor, and I know it. Influenza, he said. It came through 3 weeks ago. It's bad. His voice was the same voice she remembered from 7 years of sitting across the supper table from him in silence. Low and careful, a voice that had spent so long saying nothing that it had forgotten how to be easy with words and was doing its best with them now. 3 dead, he said. Emmett Suttles, old Marvine Holt, and a boy. He stopped. Daniel Sutton, 4 years old. His mama carried him from house to house for 2 days looking for someone who could help. He stopped again. The Reverend is down with it. Most of the Bledsoe families. The nearest doctor is 40 miles and there's no gasoline for the trip. He looked at her directly for the first time. We need your help, Nora. She heard the name. He had used her name, not girl, not child, just the name she had been born with, the name her mother had given her. She noted it the way she noted everything, without visible reaction, filing it for later consideration. She looked at the four of them standing at the edge of her clearing in the white January morning. She looked at Declan's hands on his hat brim, the knuckles reddened from the cold and the climb. She looked at Winifred Cope's face, which had the specific expression of a person who has rehearsed several things to say and has decided in the moment that none of them are adequate. She thought about Daniel Sutton, 4 years old, carried from house to house by his mother in the January cold, while the county that had called a 15-year-old girl a witch and thrown her into a November ice storm could not produce a single person capable of treating a child's fever. A 4-year-old boy dead because the knowledge that could have helped him had been driven out of the county 7 years ago by a frightened man's sermon and a community's willingness to follow it. She thought about that for a moment. She allowed herself to think about it completely without turning away from it. Then she went inside to pack. She packed for 50 people, not because she was certain there were 50 sick. She did not know how many there were. She packed for 50 because she had learned in 6 years of mountain medicine that the difference between enough and not enough was often the difference between life and death, and that the weight of carrying too much downhill was a problem she was willing to have. Elderberry syrup 12 quarts in sealed jars. Echinacea tincture 8 bottles. Yarrow tea dried and packaged in measured doses. Bone set infusion for the deep muscle aching that characterized this strain of influenza 4 quarts. Chest poultice material mustard seed and eucalyptus packed in cloth squares ready to wet and apply. Willow bark extract for fever and pain. 6 bottles each labeled with the dosage she had calibrated over years of observation and never changed without evidence. Wild cherry bark syrup for the cough that always followed the fever, because the cough was often what killed, in the end, the exhaustion of sustained coughing, breaking down the remaining defenses of a body already depleted by fever and inflammation. She packed cheesecloth and a brass scale and 3 additional measures in her mother's notebook. She was ready in 40 minutes. Winifred Cope stood in the workshop watching her pack with an expression that kept shifting between gratitude and something more complicated, the expression of a woman examining her own conscience and not entirely satisfied with what she is finding there. I need you to know, Winifred said, that not everyone agreed with what happened. Nora wrapped a jar in cloth and set it in the crate. I know, she said. It didn't help much at the time. She said it without heat. It was simply a fact offered as facts were offered for the record, without embellishment and without invitation to argue. Winifred was quiet for a moment. No, she said, it didn't. Nora lifted the crate. It was heavy. She adjusted her grip and carried it to the entrance. Tell me everything you know about the cases, she said. Onset, progression, who's been exposed to whom. I want to understand what we're dealing with before we get there. Winifred Cope straightened slightly, the instinctive straightening of a woman who has been given something useful to do. She was a woman who had spent her adult life organizing information for students who did not always want it, and the request activated something in her that the situation so far had not. She talked for the entire 4 miles down the mountain. Nora listened and did not miss a word. Harlan County looked the same and entirely different. The same storefronts on the main street, the same mountains rising above the town on every side, the same quality of winter sky sitting low over the hollows. But the streets were quieter than a January Tuesday. In a coal town should be the specific stillness of a community that has pulled inward, each household managing its own crisis behind closed doors, not yet knowing which houses are the ones to avoid and which are the ones to seek. She walked through it carrying her crate. People watched her from windows and porches. She recognized faces from 7 years ago that had aged into themselves, children grown old, people grown older, the particular aging of people who have lived hard in a difficult place and show it in the set of their shoulders as much as in their faces. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady. She went to the Sutton house first. Margaret Sutton opened the door before Nora knocked. She was a young woman, late 20s, and she had the specific devastation of a mother who has buried a child recently and has not yet found anywhere to put it. The grief, so large and so new that it had not yet found its shape, was still formless, still capable of arriving from any direction without warning. She stood in the doorway and looked at Nora and did not speak. Nora looked back at her. I'm sorry about Daniel, she said. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. Margaret Sutton nodded once, a small, precise movement that contained everything she was not capable of saying, all of it compressed into the single motion. Tell me who in this house is still sick, Nora said gently. We'll start here. The 3 weeks she spent in Harlan County would become in the years afterward one of those periods that compresses in memory, not because little happened, but because so much happened, and it happened so continuously that the mind trying to hold it all eventually imposes a kind of order on it that the living of it did not have. She moved through the town and the surrounding hollows systematically the way she moved through the cave, each morning room by room, reading each patient with the full attention she had trained herself to give. She kept a running count in the notebook cases, seen treatments administered, responses observed, adjustments made. She adjusted her protocols within the first day, increasing the yarrow concentration for the high fevers, and adding bone set to every regimen rather than reserving it for the worst cases because the worst cases were almost everyone. She slept on a pallet in the church basement. She had not been inside the Harlan County First Baptist Church since she was 12 years old, since Eleanor's funeral, and the building had the particular quality that places have when they contain both a significant memory and the present moment when the past and the present occupy the same space simultaneously. She lay on the pallet in the dark and looked up at the low ceiling and listened to the building settle around her and thought about Eleanor in the blue dress and the congregation filing past and the way grief, when it is large enough, makes the ordinary world strange. She rose at intervals through the night to check the sickest patients. She brewed fresh tea over a small wood stove in the basement kitchen, measuring doses by lamplight. She taught the healthier women the simpler preparations, standing at the kitchen table in the early hours, showing them how to make the yarrow infusion, how to judge when a fever was crossing from the body's natural defense into something dangerous, how to prepare the steam tent from blankets and boiling water infused with eucalyptus and peppermint that opened congested airways in children. She taught, freely holding nothing back. This was not generosity in the soft sense. It was a matter of principle she had arrived at through clear thinking. Healing knowledge was not something to be held and hoarded. It was something to be moved, passed from one set of hands to another, kept in motion the way water was kept in motion, because water that stopped moving went stagnant, and so did knowledge. Knowledge that existed in only one place was vulnerable. Distributed, it was nearly indestructible. She watched the women she taught pick it up with the same focused practicality she had always seen in mountain women when they were given something real to work with and trusted to do it right. They wanted to know what to do, and they wanted to know it precisely, and they wanted to be trusted to do it without supervision. Nora gave them all three. She went to Reverend Caleb Marsh on the fifth day. The Marsh house was a two-story frame structure on the good street, the street of mine, supervisors and church elders, and the town doctor. It smelled of camphor and old wood, and the specific closed-room quality of sickness that had been going on too long without adequate ventilation. Dorothea Marsh was in a chair by the window in the front room, as she had apparently been for most of the 3 years since her surgery in Charleston. She was not the woman Nora remembered, or she was that woman so thoroughly changed by what had happened inside her skull that the continuity between the two required effort to perceive. She turned her head when Nora came in and looked at her for a long moment with eyes that held a complicated recognition. Nora stopped beside the chair. She took the woman's pulse with 2 fingers at the wrist, noting the rate and the quality without making it a production. She looked at her color and her skin and the quality of her breathing. She reached into her bag and brought out a small bottle. "Take this twice a day," she said, 4 drops in water. "It will help with the headaches." Dorothea Marsh looked at the bottle. "After all this time," she said. Her voice was slow, the speech of someone for whom words had become more effortful than they used to be. "After all this time," Nora said. "Yes." She left the bottle on the windowsill and went upstairs. Reverend Caleb Marsh was in the back bedroom at the top of the stairs. He was smaller than she remembered, or the bed was larger, or sickness had accomplished what 7 years had not quite managed. It had reduced him to the dimensions of an ordinary man. He lay against the pillows with his eyes closed, his breathing audible from the doorway, the wet, rattling quality in the lower lungs that she needed to address before it worsened into something that could not be reversed. She set her bag down and went to work. She listened to his chest. She took his temperature with her lips pressed to his forehead, an old method and a reliable one for someone who had done it enough times to have calibrated the sensation. She checked his pulse and the color of his lips and the way he responded to her touch. She prepared the poultice at the small table in the corner and applied it to his chest and covered it with flannel and arranged the bedding to hold the heat. She brewed the willow bark tea on the small stove in the hallway and brought it in and sat in the chair beside the bed and spooned it into his mouth, slowly waiting for each swallow before offering the next. He surfaced partway through, his eyes opened unfocused at first, moving across the ceiling, and then finding her face with the gradual assembly of recognition that fever recovery produced. He looked at her for a long time. She continued giving him the tea. She came back each of the next 3 days. Each time he was further from the fever and more present in the room, the man reassembling himself from the illness, the way people reassemble from fevers slowly with effort, the self returning to itself in pieces. On the third day, he was sitting up against the pillows when she arrived. His color improved, his breathing, clearing to something approaching normal. He watched her prepare the morning dose with the focused attention of a man who has been thinking about something and is organizing himself to say it. She handed him the cup. He took it and held it in both hands and did not drink immediately. I need to say something to you, he said. His voice was not the pulpit voice. It was quieter than that, and it came from somewhere below the performance of himself, from the place that sickness sometimes reveals in people, the place that exists when everything that covers it has been temporarily stripped away by fever and helplessness, and the honest accounting that tends to accompany them. Nora sat in the chair. She waited. I wronged you, child, he said. The word child came out with a slight hesitation, as if he had started to say something else and corrected himself. You were 15 years old, and I stood in that pulpit, and I pointed at you in front of everyone, and I knew while I was doing it that it was wrong. I knew it before I said the first word. He stopped. Outside the window somewhere in the cold street, children were playing. Their voices came in thin and high, the particular sound of children who have been kept indoors and are using the first acceptable outdoor day with the intensity of the long confined. I was afraid, he said, because I didn't understand what you did. And I was proud because admitting I was wrong felt like it would cost me everything. My authority, the congregation's trust, my understanding of how the world was ordered. All of it built on the premise that I understood what mattered and could tell other people what to think about it. And here was a 15-year-old girl doing something I couldn't explain and couldn't control, and it frightened me more than my wife's suffering had. So I made you pay for both my fear and my pride. He looked at the cup in his hands. You were a child, he said, and I sent you into a November ice storm with nothing. The room was quiet. Nora looked at him. She looked at the old man against the pillows reduced by sickness to his actual size, and she thought about what it had actually cost her. The 3 years under Hester's roof, bad but survivable. The night of the storm that had been very nearly not survivable. The first winter in the cave that was not survivable by any reasonable calculation, and that she had survived through stubbornness and luck and a frozen rabbit. The 6 years of work, the loneliness of the first 2 years before Opal came, the morning she found the cave destroyed and had to build it back from the wreckage of a frightened boy's inherited theology. She thought about Eleanor's garden, taken down before Nora was born, the knowledge driven out of town and compressed into a notebook, because a younger version of the same man had stood in the same pulpit and pointed. She thought about all of it in approximately the time it takes to draw a full breath. Then she reached into her bag and brought out her mother's notebook. She held it for a moment. 63 pages of Eleanor Whitfield's careful handwriting, and every margin filled now. With Nora's own additions, the two voices woven together so thoroughly in some places that you could not tell where one ended and the other began. Mother and daughter in continuous conversation across the years and the distance of death. She leaned forward and placed it on the bed beside his hand. He looked down at it. I forgive you, she said, but I want you to understand something. Reverend, what I do is not witchcraft. It has never been witchcraft. It is paying attention. It is listening to what the earth is trying to teach us and taking the trouble to write down what you learn so it can be passed on. My mother understood that, her mother before her. Women going back further than your church or any church. Women who understood that the difference between a plant that heals and a plant that harms is knowledge. And that knowledge is not dark and it is not ungodly. It is the most faithful thing a person can do with the world they were given. She let that sit in the room for a moment. You nearly destroyed something precious because you didn't understand it. You nearly made sure it ended with me that everything my mother and her mother and the women before them had accumulated over generations would stop with a 15-year-old girl in the mud. I need you to promise me something. Promise me you will not let that happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone who comes after me. Not to any woman who knows something you don't understand. He looked at the notebook beside his hand. He did not reach for it yet. He looked at it the way you look at something, you need to pick up, but that will cost you something to hold. That will require you to become slightly different from what you have been in order to hold it properly. I promise, he said. It was almost a whisper, but it was clear and it was direct, and it was the voice of a man who understood what he was saying. She looked at him for one more moment. The winter light came through the window and fell across the quilt on the bed and made the old man look in that ordinary illumination very small and very tired and fundamentally alone with the accounting of himself. She stood up. She went to the door. She did not look back. she found Declan Pruitt waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He was sitting on the second step from the bottom with his hat in his hands in the posture of a man who has been waiting a long time and has made his peace with the waiting. He looked up when he heard her on the stairs. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He brought out a package wrapped in brown paper. The paper creased and slightly worn, the creases of something that has been handled many times over a period of years, taken out and looked at, and put back again, the physical record of a decision carried a long time before being acted on. He held it out to her. She took it. She unwrapped it, standing there at the foot of the marsh staircase. Her mother's Bible. The red clay had been cleaned from the cover with care. Someone had treated the leather with oil more than once by the quality of the conditioning, maintaining it against the drying and cracking that would have destroyed it in 7 years otherwise. The pages were intact, slightly wavy from the moisture of that November puddle 7 years ago, but intact and legible, every page present. She stood with it in her hands. "I couldn't speak up," Declan said. His voice was low and aimed at the floor. "I know that's not an excuse. I've had 7 years to understand that it's not an excuse. I've had 7 years to understand exactly what it is, which is cowardice dressed in a suit of helplessness. But I couldn't speak up, and I couldn't let it sink." He stopped. "So I kept it," he said. "I kept it until I could give it back." Nora looked at the Bible in her hands. She thought about the scrap of paper that had appeared in her coat pocket in the attic at Hester's house, Opal Tully's name, and the ridge above Darnell's Hollow, and the line she had read by candlelight, "She knew your mother." The note that had guided her north through the storm, and through the mountain, and into the rest of her life. She had always known without allowing herself to be certain whose handwriting that had been. She looked at Declan Pruitt sitting on the bottom stair, with his hat in his hands. This man who had practiced silence so long it had become his nature, and who had twice done the only brave thing his nature allowed him to do, once on a night 7 years ago, when he had written a note and tucked it into a coat lining and retrieved a Bible from the mud, and once today climbing a mountain on bad knees to return what he had kept. She sat down beside him on the stair. They sat there for a while without speaking, which was comfortable in the way that certain silences are comfortable, the ones that do not require filling, because both people understand what is in them. "Thank you," she said finally. He nodded at the floor. She went home. She went back to the mountain, and the world had shifted beneath her in the way that sometimes happens, without announcement, the tectonic kind of change that you only recognize after the ground has already moved and you are standing on different terrain than you were standing on before. People from Harlan County began making the trip to the cave, not as petitioners with the guilty, shuffling desperation of the delegation in January, but as neighbors. Ordinary people who knocked at the cave entrance and asked ordinary questions and listened with the attention of people who had decided to actually hear the answers, rather than simply wait for a pause in which to assert what they had already decided. Some came to learn. Nora taught them all. She met Garrett Hale in the spring of 1945. He had come back from the European theater in November of 1944 on a troop transport that docked in Baltimore in the gray November rain, and had spent the winter at his mother's house 2 hollows east of Harlan, trying to remember how to sleep without listening for things that were no longer coming. His mother had been writing him letters throughout the war, the kind of detailed accounting of local life that mountain mothers write to sons in distant places, and those letters had mentioned more than once the woman in Darnell's Hollow. He climbed the mountain for the first time on a Tuesday morning in April, arriving at the cave entrance with the deliberate, unhurried quality of a man who had learned somewhere in the past 3 years not to waste motion, that every movement had a cost and a purpose, and the two needed to be in proportion. He was tall and lean, with carpenter's hands, the hands of someone who has worked wood long enough that the wood has left its mark on him, and the eyes of someone who had seen enough of certain things to have permanently recalibrated what mattered and what did not. He looked at the cave entrance and the frame structure around it, and the visible organization of the workshop beyond. He looked at it the way a craftsman looks at another craftsman's work, reading the decisions, understanding the constraints, finding where he would have done the same and where he would have done differently and why. Nora came out of the entrance and found him studying the doorframe joint. "Good mortise," he said. "Who built this?" "3 men from Bledsoe," she said. "They did the framing. I did the design." He looked at her. "The design is better than the execution," he said. She considered him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I didn't want to say anything. They carried the lumber up the mountain." He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that meant the full smile was available, but was being held in reserve, which she would come to understand was simply how he was a man who did not deploy warmth carelessly, but who, once he had decided to give it, gave it completely. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. He brought tools, and he fixed the doorframe joint without being asked, and then he fixed the shelving brackets in the workshop that had been slightly misaligned since the Bledsoe men built them, and then he looked at the seed bank she had described to him one afternoon when they were working in the cave together, and said nothing for 3 days, and then came back with a design for a proper climate-controlled storage chamber that used the cave's natural temperature differential in a way she had not thought of using. The difference between the deep chamber and the main chamber to create a passive cooling system that would keep seeds viable longer. She watched him work with the specific attention she gave to things she was trying to understand. He was a man who expressed himself most completely through what he built. The quality of care in the work was the quality of care in the man, and it was considerable, and it was consistent, which she valued more than the quality alone. They were married in September of 1946 on the ridge above the hollow, on the pod where Opal Tully had lived, and where the long view stretched to the horizon in every direction, with wildflowers on a makeshift altar that Garrett had built from 2 sawhorses and a plank, and which was, she noted when she walked toward it, perfectly level. Opal Tully's rocking chair sat empty in the front row, with a sprig of wild bergamot on the seat. Some absences deserve to be honored. Some people deserve to be present at the things they had made possible. Together that winter, Garrett built a classroom into the expanded cave, a proper framed space with a long table and benches and a small wood stove and a chalkboard he had salvaged from the closed school in Bledsoe, and hauled up the mountain on his back over 2 trips declining help, because the mountain was, he said, something he needed to do at his own pace. Nora held teaching sessions there every week for anyone who wanted to learn, and she taught them all without condition and without charge and without holding anything back, because the knowledge was not hers to hold. Garrett built a seed bank that winter as well, the design he had worked out during those 3 silent days after she described it to him, a deep chamber lined with limestone that used the cave's own temperature differential to maintain conditions optimal for long-term seed storage, cool and dry and stable, the kind of stability that only the earth itself could provide and maintain indefinitely. He built each of their 4 children a small garden plot outside the cave entrance, scaled to a child's reach and a child's attention span, and by the time the youngest could walk, she could identify 30 medicinal plants by sight and smell, and could tell you in the serious way of children who have grown up around serious work what each one was for. The years that followed were the years of building. Nora wrote, she had been writing all her life in margins and on borrowed paper and in notebooks ordered from Lexington, but in the late 1940s and through the 1950s, she began to synthesize, to take the accumulated knowledge of her mother's notebook and Opal's 14 notebooks and her own 2 decades of practice and her medical texts and her pharmacology books and the daily records she had kept since the cave, and find the underlying structure. The principles that connected individual observations into something teachable, the pattern that ran through all of it. The result was a book. She called it The Mountain Healer's Guide. It was modest in physical form, printed at a shop in Harlan, and bound in cloth covers that Garrett stitched himself 140 pages with botanical illustrations. She drew herself in the careful, detailed style her mother had used, each illustration, accompanied by notes on identification, cultivation, harvest timing, preparation, dosage, and the specific conditions for which each plant was and was not appropriate. It contained no claims that could not be supported by her own records across hundreds of patients. It contained no remedies that had not been tested and observed and adjusted over years of practice. It was, in other words, a record of a mind that had paid close attention to the world for a very long time, which was what Eleanor's notebook had been, which was what Opal's notebooks had been, which was what the women before them had been making all along without calling it anything in particular. It was passed from hand to hand across southern Appalachia until the pages were soft and fell apart and had to be carefully recopied. Some of the copies were better than the original. Women added their own observations in the margins, their own corrections and additions and disagreements, and these annotated versions became their own kind of documents, records of a distributed intelligence that had been operating in these mountains for longer than anyone could trace. Nora read some of the annotated copies when they came back to her and wrote down the additions she had not known, and felt something she recognized as the particular satisfaction of a system working exactly the way it was designed to work. By the 1960s, the Mountain Medicine Workshop supplied herbal preparations to communities across southern West Virginia and into parts of Virginia and Kentucky. Nora had personally trained more than 200 women in the practice of herbalism, not as dependents of her knowledge, but as independent practitioners carrying their own portion of it in their own directions. She continued to order books from Lexington. The shop was under new management, now had been for 15 years, but the practice of occasionally tucking an additional title into the order with a handwritten note had continued past from Lucinda Cross to her daughter, and then to a young man who had inherited the business and apparently inherited the habit, along with the inventory. In 1971, a team from the State University arrived. They came with clipboards and careful courtesy, in the particular posture of academics who are prepared to be respectful of something they expect to find primitive, which is a posture that has a very specific quality that experienced people learn to recognize. They had heard about the operation through a paper trail that ran from a mention in a regional public health report to an inquiry from a federal researcher to a conversation at a conference that had eventually produced funding and a mandate. They arrived expecting folk medicine. They found a pharmaceutical laboratory. Not in the architectural sense. The cave was still a cave, the workshop still rough sawn boards and glass jars, and a chalkboard covered in Nora's small, precise chalk notations. But the operations it contained, the cultivation protocols refined over 30 years of observation, the extraction methods developed empirically through direct outcome measurement, the quality control procedures, the dosing records maintained with the consistency of a clinical trial, constituted something that the pharmacologist, whose name was Dr. Raymond Gall, had to stop and reassess his categories to properly describe. The active compounds in Nora's plants were real and measurable. Her extraction methods were pharmacologically sound, in some cases more efficient than standard laboratory procedures because she had arrived at them by observing what worked rather than by deriving them from theory. Her dosing, refined across decades of practice, across hundreds of patients, was precise, in a way that he found extraordinary, because precision without instrumentation required a quality of sustained attention that most trained practitioners did not maintain. He published a paper. Nora read it with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, sitting at the long pine table in the workshop on a February morning, with a cup of black coffee and the particular patience she brought to documents that were going to tell her something she already knew in a different language. She read it twice. Nice of them to confirm what Opal knew 50 years ago, she said. Garrett, who was in the corner, repairing a cabinet hinge with the same focused care he had brought to every piece of work in this cave for 25 years, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family and did not look up from the hinge. The paper brought attention. Journalists came and botanists and several physicians who had the intellectual honesty to arrive with genuine questions rather than prepared conclusions. Nora received them all with the same directness she brought to everything without performance and without false modesty. She showed them the plants and the records in the workshop, and she introduced them to patients who could speak for themselves, which they did with the particular authority of people whose relationship to the subject was not theoretical. She asked only that they represent her work honestly, not as mystical, not as primitive, as what it was: careful attention to real things conducted with rigor over a long time, producing real results that could be measured and replicated and built upon. Most of them complied. Caleb Marsh died in 1955. Nora heard about it from Winifred Cope, who had maintained a correspondence with her through the years, letters arriving every few months with the news from the county, the small and large events of a community moving through time. He kept his promise, Winifred wrote. He said so himself more than once in those last years. He said it was the only thing he did in his life that he was not ashamed of. Nora read the letter at the workshop table on a morning in October when the light was coming through the cave entrance at the low autumn angle, and the cave smelled of drying herbs and the particular mineral quality it always had in the cooler months. She thought about the old man in the back bedroom with her mother's notebook beside his hand. She thought about what it had cost a man like that to keep a promise like that. The daily choosing of it, the setting aside of the old habit of certainty, each time a new version of the same fear came knocking. The architecture of a man like Caleb Marsh was not built for the kind of sustained humility that promise required. It had cost him something real. She thought it had probably cost him more than she would ever know. She wrote back to Winifred and said she was sorry to hear it. She meant it. Garrett Hale died on a November morning in 1988, quietly in the bed he had built from chestnut lumber in 1947, with the long view of mountains through the window and Nora beside him. He went the way he had lived, without waste or drama, the way a craftsman who has done good work goes with the account settled and the tools put away. Nora buried him on the ridge near Opal's grave, where the view stretched 30 miles in every direction. She planted wild bergamot on the grave as she had planted it on Opal's, because it was the plant that smelled like something that had decided to be cheerful regardless of circumstances, and she thought that was appropriate for both of them. She was 66 years old. She continued to work. She died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1999. She was 77 years old, and she died in the cabin that Garrett had built for her on the ridge above the hollow, on the same ridge where Opal Tully had lived, and died with the same long view of mountains stretching to the horizon that Opal had looked at every morning for 40 years, and that Nora had looked at every morning for 53 years, the view that never repeated itself exactly, that was always slightly different in the light that gave you, if you paid attention to it, the sense of something patient and enduring, that the events of human lives moved across without altering. Her 4 children were there, Elspeth and Ruth and May, and the youngest Thomas, who had driven through the night from Knoxville when his sister called. 11 grandchildren, most of them. The window was open because Elspeth had opened it at dawn when the light came pink and clear over the eastern ridge, and the air came in smelling of the wild bergamot that Nora had planted along every path on the property over the years, from the cave entrance up the trail to the cabin, spreading until the whole south face of the mountain carried the smell of it in the morning air. Nora had asked for the window to be open. She lay with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the quilt, the way she had always lain when she was thinking, and for a while the children thought she was sleeping, and then for a while longer they were not sure, and then they understood. She was wearing inside the front of her nightgown the leather-bound notebook, her mother's 63 pages and her own lifetime of editions pressed against her chest, exactly as it had been pressed there in the hidden pocket of her coat on the morning they threw her out of Hester Pruitt's house into the November mud. Some things you keep close your whole life, not because you cannot let them go, because they are the thing that made you what you are, and you do not want to forget, even at the end, what it cost to become it. The seed bank she had built in the deep chamber of the cave was donated to a regional conservation trust. It contained 312 distinct varieties of native Appalachian medicinal plants, many of them now rare or endangered in the wild, preserved in the stable cool of the cave that had been doing this work of preservation for 10,000 years before Nora arrived, and that would go on doing it long after. The 47 teaching notebooks she had filled over the course of her life, covering everything from basic botanical identification to advanced tincture chemistry, to patient records spanning 3 decades of practice, were archived at the State University's Special Collections Library. They were cataloged under her name. They were made available to researchers. They were used. The Mountain Medicine Workshop continued under Elspeth's direction and then under Elspeth's daughter's direction, and it continues to this day in the same cave, in the same limestone chambers, with the same south-facing entrance that catches the winter sun, and the same spring that has been running since before anyone who has ever used it was born. And every spring when the red buds come out on the south-facing slopes and the wild bergamot begins its slow ascent toward bloom, women from across the Appalachian region make their way up the trail to Darnell's Hollow. They come from West Virginia and Kentucky and Virginia, and from places further than that now, places where the name Nora Whitfield Hale has traveled in the way that names travel when they are attached to something real and lasting, something that changed the shape of the world in ways that can still be measured. They call it the Yarb Walk, a weekend of teaching and learning and walking the ridges with eyes open to the plants growing in the margins and the hollows, which is where the useful things have always grown in the places that other people pass by because they are not looking. A weekend of remembering the girl who was thrown into the cold with nothing and who responded by growing a pharmacy inside a mountain. They bring their own notebooks. They write things in the margins. What stays with you when you sit with a life like Nora Whitfield's? Is it the cruelty of what was done to her? A community that turned on a child because a frightened man needed somewhere to point his fear. The specific coldness of it, the mud and the split boot and the Bible sinking the people whose children she had healed, finding other directions to look in when she passed. Is it the resilience, the girl who walked north into the storm with nothing but a hidden notebook and a scrap of paper with a stranger's name on it and the absolute refusal to become what the world had decided she was? Or is it something quieter than either of those things? The mirrors. Those pieces of broken glass she collected from the cave floor from the wreckage of some moonshiner's vanity and positioned one by one against the walls at angles that sent light further into the darkness than it would have reached on its own. Not bought, not manufactured, not brought in from outside. Found in the rubble and turned toward use. That is what she did with everything they threw at her. The banishment, the isolation, the destroyed garden, the years of cold and hunger and silence. The accusation that the thing she did most naturally was the most dangerous thing a woman could do. The inheritance of a mother who had been made to tear down what she built and who had put everything she knew into a notebook and given it to a daughter who would not be made to do the same. She collected every piece of it. She turned it toward the light. She grew something in it that the world needed. There is a question that a life like this puts to anyone paying attention. Not a comfortable question. The kind that sits with you after the story is over and the light has changed and you are still thinking about a girl in red mud and a cave full of green things and what it means to refuse absolutely and stubbornly and magnificently to let the world's rejection become your definition. The question is not complicated. What are you carrying in the hidden pocket of your coat? What has been given to you or taken from you or thrown at you like something worthless that you have not yet turned toward the light? What knowledge, what skill, what way of seeing the world, what understanding of how things grow or how things heal or how things might be different if someone would only pay close enough attention has been dismissed or ridiculed or declared dangerous by people who were simply afraid of what they didn't understand because the mountain is already there. It has always been there. The cave is waiting with its south-facing entrance and its natural spring and its limestone walls that have been storing heat and holding things safe since long before any of us arrived. And the only question that has ever really mattered is whether you are willing to dig. Nora Whitfield was not a witch. She was a woman who listened to the earth, and the earth as it always does for those patient enough to hear it answered back.